Welcome to Our Montana. I'm Mike Penfold, your program host. You know, at Our Montana, we are really interested in history projects. We've done battlefield studies, and we did a lot of work on the Bozeman Trail and other projects that we find particularly interesting. And one of the things that you notice as you're doing these projects is how much of the history books focus around men. But one thing that I really noticed when we were doing the Bozeman Trail, we started looking at, there's some stories about the men and what they did on the Bozeman Trail back in the 1860s. But we got the women's diaries and started reading those, because actually they had a lot of information in them. And you began to see the role that women play in that history that seems like it's dominated by men. It wouldn't have happened. We found this one diary. One day we found a grave along the Bozeman Trail. It was a small grave. It had little flat rocks on top of it. And we didn't know anything. There was nothing in the diaries about it. And then a little bit later on, maybe a couple years later, we got a letter from a person who found a diary from a family called French. And that family had lost a baby, died, along the Bozeman Trail. They got above the Stillwater River. This baby was sick, a year and a half old. And they stopped the whole wagon train for 2 days to see if they could give this baby a chance to recover. Well, it's a sad story. The night, describing in the diary, the wolves were howling and the snow was glistening from the moon off the Beartooth Mountains, and this little child passed away. The next morning, men pulled a few extra boards off the wagon, they made a little coffin, and they buried this little child there above the Stillwater River. They said words over the grave. They put some flat stones so the wolves wouldn't dig up the child. They hitched up their wagons and went west. That's how women saw it. And we're talking about women who had a lot of bravery. You see these little shacks in Montana that are now windblown and all knocked down, and you think, oh, those tough men out there. No. You see in the springtime maybe a few daffodils come up, or maybe you see a clump of wild plums there that are still growing, or an apple tree that's all broken down now. You know, women were part of that. Strong women, women with grit. And I've got a friend with me today, Gene Hough from Broadus, Montana. Gene, normally I'd reach across here and shake hands with you, but we can't quite do it. I'm so happy to have you here. And I know a little bit about your story. I know you grew up in Carter County.
I did.
On a sheep ranch. And I would like to visit a little bit about that.
Okay.
So what do you remember in your childhood?
Well, I remember working sheep, loving sheep. One of my first memories of really enjoying sheep was after we had spent 2.5 years in Belle Fourche during the drought of the Depression, like 1931, 34, somewhere in there. Mm-hmm. My dad had to take our sheep down there for them to survive because we were out of grass in Carter County. And I went to the 1st and 2nd grade down there. And then in the spring when I got home, we had already moved the sheep back to the Carter County ranch, and they were already lambing by the time the family got there. And there was a string of little lambs with tails twisting, racing along the edge of the cliff and back and forth as they were coming into the corrals. And I just thought, oh, we're home, we're home.
Back home, how far were you from the ranch from Broadus?
About 60 miles.
Oh.
You can go to Alzada and then on into little corner of Wyoming and then into Belle Fourche.
Where'd you go to school in?
We went to country schools in our yard.
Oh, had a school in your yard?
Oh, yeah. Dad, well, we were about the our family and then some cousins were the only kids in the area at that time, and there was enough of us that we could establish a school.
You could have enough for a teacher.
Yeah, right.
And you hired the teacher, your families?
It was a county paid, it was a school district. Well, there was a district that hired the teacher. She boarded with us. In some cases, she would stay in the schoolhouse, in a little corner of the schoolhouse. And then we'd go up there for classes and then
So your story isn't walking 10 miles to school?
Ours is not, no. Our
You were right there.
Our little cousins had to walk about 2 miles.
Is that right?
Yeah, but we had the schoolhouse right in our yard, mainly to keep it supplied with wood and water and stuff like, and kids.
And yes.
Yeah,
so you had a big family.
Yes, there were 10 of us. I was third in line. My older brother and my older sister were, of course, typical ranch kids, milking cows, herding sheep, chasing horses, and hauling water, hauling wood, and putting the chickens in at night, gathering eggs.
I'll bet you had a number of chores to do as a young lady there.
We did, but I chose to, I desperately wanted to learn how to milk cows. So when I was about in the 3rd grade, I was able finally to milk well enough to get foam on the bucket. That was my goal.
Is that?
Yes.
I didn't know that was a challenge.
Oh,
you got to get.
That's when you know you're a milker.
You got strong hands, I bet.
Yes, yes.
Yeah.
So I chose to milk cows and help with those chores rather than stay in the house and wash dishes and help with the housework. My older sister was actually the person that helped my mother the most with kids, with cooking, with a lot of the household chores.
So you were number 3.
I was number 3.
And your older sister was a couple of years older than you?
Yeah. Us kids were about 2 years apart. You could count our birthdays. In 2 years, there was another baby. Then 1 year, there were twins.
Oh, my goodness. Your mom was something else, wasn't she?
She was.
Yeah.
She was. She was a neighboring one of 3 girls in a German family that had come over. My grandparents came over from Germany in 1907. First went to North Dakota, gradually came on west to Montana and homesteaded in the area where my dad had homesteaded. And so a neighboring girl is pickings for a wife.
You aren't kidding there. And he found one.
And he found one.
And he found
yes.
a good one of these women with grit I was talking about.
Yes, yeah.
I bet you had some chores in the summertime when you weren't in school, didn't you?
Oh yeah, that's when we took the sheep further away from the ranch out to the pastures to the south and to the west, and that required going with a sheep wagon and a dog and just stay with them night and day. And us kids did that. My older brother and sister did, and I did. And we'd stay for a week or 2 at a time, and then we'd come into the house, and another kid would go out and stay with them.
So you did that? Were you by yourself?
Mm-hmm.
How old would you have been then?
11, 12,
Are you kidding me?
13, no.
Yeah, it's important.
That's what we did.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's how you made that ranch work, isn't it?
Yep. And we had a stake pin that we could drive in the ground and we could hobble our horse, but they often could get away in hobbles. Mm-hmm. So we staked them, and then they'd graze around the stake pin, and then we'd have a horse there in the morning.
So you had a dog too?
Oh yeah.
A sheepdog?
Oh yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
Wow,
Yeah.
what an interesting life.
Yes.
Was that scary for a 12-year-old girl?
Not really. Not really.
That's the way life was.
Yeah.
I guess.
Yeah.
That's amazing. So life moves on. So you're 12 and 13 and 14. Mm-hmm. What did you do for high school?
Well, the county high school was at Ekalaka, which was way to the north of where our ranch was. So the plan was for us to go into Broadus to high school, which was much closer and a better road. But that year, in February, the year that I was in the 8th grade, my dad was taking my mother to Miles City to wait for the birth of their newest child, who was my brother Gary.
So this is number 10?
It's number 10. And the custom was to take the mother to either Belfouche or Miles City, and then they'd wait the 2 or 3 weeks before the birth, so that they could be in a hospital and with a doctor.
Can't do it when you're in the process.
And they stayed overnight at by then my German grandparents had moved over to Powder River County, where Grandpa was running a coal mine. And Dad and Mom and my brother Alvin, who drove for my dad, because he had by then developed heart disease, and he was not strong enough to be traveling alone in case he had to shovel out a snowbank or change a tire. And they stayed at my grandparents' house that night, and he suffered a fatal heart attack.
Oh, Jane.
Yeah. So my mom went on to Miles City, where she delivered Gary in March the 8th. My brother Alvin came home to the ranch and called us kids out of school and told us that our dad had died.
My.
And so then the task was to go on running the ranch. And the plan, though, was that I would go to high school and my sister Tootie would go to high school. So my brother Alvin pretty much assumed the head of the family position.
So
then.
how old would he have been then?
He would have been 4 years older than I, so he was 17.
He was 17.
He was 17 when Dad died. And Mom could not drive. She could not.
She didn't drive a car?
She didn't drive a car. She had almost no education. She was 33 years old, and she had 10 children.
My gracious.
1,000 head of sheep, about 20 sections of land, and lots of debt and no money. So we struggled on.
You struggled on.
Yeah.
So this would have been about
1943.
1943, so the war is going on.
World War II is gone. I can remember the day of Pearl Harbor. My dad was sitting with his ear glued to the battery telephone, listening as much as static would allow to the news of the war. And it was I could tell by his face that it was a very terrible, serious, altering news that he was getting.
Oh boy.
Yeah.
So he was hearing about Pearl Harbor. So how did you guys survive?
Well, Dad had taken out 2 small life insurance policies, which gave, I think, about $50 a month to my mother that we used for groceries. And then, of course, at shearing time, we had a wool crop and a lamb crop.
So you made some.
So we made land payments and struggled along, and that's how we limped along into the post-World War II world.
Oh, my gracious.
I boarded in a family home in Broadus with a family whose daughter became one of my lifelong best friends.
Oh.
And she was a lady, too, that had had a big family and a lot of hardships. And so we had a lot in common. But high school was good for me. I was a fairly good student. And I enjoyed high school, so I did manage to graduate. By then, the war was over, and the young men were coming home. And one of them turned out to be my husband, who was 10 years older than I.
Oh, is that right?
Yeah, so we met at a dance. And,
oh, my gosh.
And it wasn't long until I had a household of my own.
So how old were you then? So
18.
18?
18.
Well, you started young, didn't you?
Yeah. I went to work in the courthouse, working for the county treasurer, where I really learned to balance funds to the penny. And I enjoyed numbers and have always enjoyed bookkeeping.
How was your mom getting along during this period?
Well, the kids were growing up, of course. She was having a lot of trouble keeping them in school, and it was getting harder and harder to
From the
get
standpoint of working and needing work at the ranch, you mean, or they just didn't want to stay?
The kids didn't want to go to school, and we were having trouble getting qualified teachers.
Oh, okay.
It was, and the kids would head off to school, and then by then the schoolhouse had moved to accommodate another family further away, so they did have to walk about a mile to school, and they might just drop off and spend the day over in the creek eating choke cherries or something.
They had their priorities right, I'd say.
But they didn't get very good schooling. Yes.
Were you living at the ranch then?
No, my husband and I were living in Broadus. Yeah.
And so how'd things go for your mom now? With the kids growing up?
Growing up, and it was getting harder and harder for her to manage the ranch because Alvin then had married and moved on. So she did marry. The young fellow who had been in the war but who had been discharged for some issue that I think had to do with unsuitability for the military.
Uh-oh.
But he was a ranching person and his dad had a small ranch fairly close to Broadus. And they married, and he pretty well took over the running of the ranch and taking care of Mom's assets, which were also my siblings' assets.
Yeah.
And he did not believe that the kids deserved to be sent to high school because he said they had not worked hard enough during this one summer.
Oh my.
Putting up hay and fixing fence at wherever there was to do. He was a younger man and not very able to manage a bunch of teenage kids who were becoming independent and had ideas of their own.
Probably with some rough edges there.
Yeah. My husband and I had been in California briefly to work, and we'd been home on a visit. And on this visit, we found out that they were not going to send my two siblings that needed to be in high school. He wasn't going to pay for their board and room. And so we decided to come back and take them ourselves and put them in school. Because I knew it had been very important for my dad, for the kids, for me to get an education.
Get that basic education.
Yeah, it was that
you were
time.
working in where you needed to have some education
right.
at that time.
And we knew it.
Yeah.
We knew it. So we came back. We had a little house, and we took these two that were in high school and started them in high school. And sometime in that early fall, late October, early November, there was almost a fatality at the ranch where my one older brother was protecting the younger brother that had been born when my dad, he was the littlest guy. Yeah. The stepfather had started beating up on this younger brother because he hadn't got the wooden coal in the night before. And then the older brother came out to protect the little brother, and incident happened with a hunting knife and a chair raised up and going to whack him with the chair. And it was not a fatality, but the stepfather was stabbed in the chest with this hunting knife.
The brother was defending
He just
himself.
held the knife, and he said he ran into it because he was kind of an angry man. But anyway, after that, my uncle brought the younger ones in and said, "You better get them out of there before something terrible happens." And I began to know then that he was also pretty much appropriating all of the livestock and possessions that were the ranch's assets. So I got an attorney, and I went to court and was given guardianship of the siblings, the underage siblings.
You were guardian.
I was guardian.
How old are you now, Jean?
22,
Oh, my goodness.
21, 22.
With a new husband?
With a new husband. But he supported me all the way.
Yes. A good man.
Yes, he knew that was important. He knew it was essential. So he supported everything we did. So
now you've got several of your siblings in your house with
five.
You.
Five, yes. And at that time, we both still had jobs. He was a mechanic, And I was still working in I believe I was working in the bank then, because the courthouse had changed. There was a new treasurer, so I wasn't working there anymore.
Oh, my. Well, I hope your mom was doing okay.
Well, she was, yeah. She started a new family with this fella, had 2 more children by him. And then, irony of ironies, they struck oil in Bell Creek in the 1960s on land that was his father's.
Oh, so he ended up with some money.
He ended up with lots of money.
Sounds like there's a little bit of a rainbow on the end of that story.
Yes.
Yeah. So now you're 22. You're in Broadus. Tell us what else you've done here. You got a pretty remarkable childhood there, kiddo.
Well, yes, working in the bank and keeping the kids in school was that was pretty much my life until they started growing up and going on with jobs and further education and getting married. But by then I realized, Cap and I, my husband, realized that we liked kids and we didn't have any of our own, and tried to figure out what was wrong here, because usually kids just come.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
but we found out that I was not able to have children.
Oh.
So we started the process of adoption. And we adopted Steve, and he was about 6 weeks old. Got him in October, I think, of 1960. And then 2 years later, we got Andrea, a daughter from Miles City. Dr. Stickney, who was a friend of ours, knew of this child. So then we had...
Dr. Stickney's a friend of mine, too.
Is he?
Yes, he is.
Yes. So then we had children to raise, and...
Your husband became mayor, too, of Broadus.
Oh, yeah.
Is that?
Yeah, while we were living in Broadus, he started serving on the town council, and he was naturally kind of an engineer, and at that time in Broadus, the streets were all just mud.
Really?
And he devised a way of shaping the streets and forming some gutters, and got the streets kind of graveled and then paved. He was on board when they planned and instituted the sewage lagoons, so that we had we wanted to become an incorporated town, and there were some things you had to do in order to do that. And one of them was have a sewage system and a water system.
What would Broadus be like without those basic things now, Gene?
Yeah, well, it would still be, it might have blown away, but it was a county seat.
Oh, yeah.
And it's a really a through highway, you know, from the west to east and even north-south. There's now a good highway from Ekalaka that comes down
That's a good
and
one.
joins, yeah.
Yeah, Broadus is a wonderful little town.
But it's really isolated.
It is.
It's about 90 to 100 miles to either a city in either direction. Miles City's 80, Gillette's 90, Belle Fourche is 100 miles.
Gene, I know that you were an early member of the Northern Plains Resources Council.
Yes, I was.
What's the story there? What got you interested in that?
Well, during those years, the college at Bozeman offered a opportunity for citizens to apply for a scholarship to the Kellogg Foundation. Kellogg Foundation was funding a learning project to help prepare local communities to help their folks learn some leadership potential. It was to travel and study. You would spend some time in Bozeman at the campus studying, and then you would travel. The first year we traveled in the United States.
So you got onto that program?
I applied and was accepted, yes. And I think each year there was a class, and I think there's about 20, 30 people.
Oh.
And the Kellogg Foundation funded that project. And the plan was to expose local people to the wider world, the state, the nation, and the globe. The first year we traveled in Montana, visited the aluminum smelting facility up at Columbia Falls in Montana. The second year we went to Washington, D.C., and visited our senator in the office. And it was while we were there, we began to have some concerns about the development of energy in southeast Montana. And we were shown a map that was a proposal to build something like 20 power generating units on the on that section of the country, the southeast Montana, from Coal Strip on up the river. And the local people that were fighting that, partly because it was, they were being told they had to sell their mineral rights so that coal could be developed there. And one of these old gentlemen was Mr. Boyd Charter. And they said, well, you might as well sell because your neighbor has sold and you're just going to be isolated. And they said, well, what is it going to take to buy your mineral rights? And he said, always $5 more than your last offer. But anyway, when we were looking at this map where they were proposing this huge energy production area using Montana coal and ripping up the valley, and they said, well, there's no people out there, it's just sagebrush and antelope, which was an insult to us because
so.
It was our home. And yes, Northern Plains began to be formed up then, and I joined on and have been a member ever since. And I'm very grateful for the role Northern Plains has played in the role of developing Montana.
They have done a wonderful, wonderful job.
Yeah.
Bringing these issues to people's attention.
And they always had good, reliable information that ranchers demand. They want to know what's the law, what's real here.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
They really pay attention.
Yeah.
So, Jean, what keeps you busy now?
Well, staying alive.
Yeah, for us spring chickens, that's kind of important, isn't it?
Yeah, staying alive.
Yeah.
Well, I managed to have, all my life, I've had really good friends and an interest in good books and good conversation and knowing what's going on. But one of the things that happened during my most formative years was my husband and I developed a motel in Broadus. So we met a lot of interesting people. One of them was a fellow named Bob Meade, who worked for the USGS, and he was in love with rivers, and they wanted to come to Broadus and study the last undammed river in the West, and that happened to be Powder River. Powder River. He came out every fall, and he brought different guys with him. They took measurements and did studies and really tried to understand the way the river meandered, the siltration, the makeup of the water, and realized that some of the salt was coming from Wyoming. It was just a school to learn.
Yeah.
When they'd sit at your dinner table and tell you what they had done today.
So you've had some impact on that too.
Yeah.
Jean?
They invited me to go along with them on a long boat trip from Baton Rouge, Louisiana, up through all the locks and dams of the Mississippi, clear up to St. Paul, Minnesota. It was a laboratory boat, and I was to be the cook for a crew of about 7 people. I did that 2 years in a row, and it's about a 2-week trip.
Another adventure.
Yeah, it was quite an adventure.
Yeah.
The worst thing was that I didn't get to see much because there's such overgrowth on both sides of the river, and the boat was just down.
Oh.
But I remember my impression was there was an awful lot of old, rusty, abandoned machinery up and down the banks of the Mississippi. and they were taking water samples. They had a crew on board who were sampling the water of the Mississippi all up through that length. And on one of those years, after I wasn't their cook anymore, they made one more trip. And then they had that huge, huge flood.
Oh, yeah.
Do you remember when the whole Midwest
yeah.
flooded?
I do.
And I said, now your samples are all changed.
Yeah,
and they said,
go
yeah,
do it
but
again.
we...
You want to go cook for them again?
I probably wouldn't do that again.
Gene, Hough, we've run out of time.
Have we run out
We
of time?
have.
Oh,
And it's been such a joy listening to your story. And God bless you for the work that you've done.
well,
And I'd shake hands with you, but I'll give you an elbow rub.
okay.
Come back and see us.
Okay.